Hi, everyone, and welcome to this episode of Testing Tips and Tools, sponsored by Applitools. Very excited to be here today. My name is Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLead. I am joined by another one of my great hosts, who is Amit Zor. He is an engineer at Applitools. You can follow him on Twitter at Amit Zor, very easy to find. And our guest today is Kent C. Dodds. And Kent is a full stack JavaScript engineer and trainer. Kent, we are so excited to have you today. We love everything you're doing for the community, of course.
Well, thank you. I'm super happy to be here.
Yeah. So we have quite a few awesome questions. I know, Amit, you prepared a few. So I'll let you ask the first one and I'll jump in as we kind of get started.
Well, sure. Let's dive into it. Just before that, I have to say I'm very, very excited about this episode. Kent is a real mentor, I think, over the internet. I've seen, I don't know, a tons of your posts and courses, just to name a few, on Egghead, on Frontend Masters. Now you have your own testingjavascript.com. And I have to also note a few of your open source projects. So actually, I digged it up a little bit, and I saw that CrossEnv is yours, which I wasn't aware, by the way.
Yeah, that was one of my earlier projects, but I guess it has become a bit of a staple. A lot of people use that.
Yeah, it brings a lot of value, I can say that.
Thank you.
Then over the course of years, autocompletely would change to downshift.
Yeah.
And React testing library, and today you have a newsletter. So a ton of contribution to the ecosystem, and I think you're well known in the industry.
No, thank you.
So after doing all this, getting you feel comfortable. Okay, so let's start with it. I think a question that a lot of front-end developers ask themselves today, or find themselves in the situation where they have a front-end application. I have developed something that's already quite big, but I haven't done any sort of testing whatsoever. And at this point, I want to start testing my application. So a lot of developers ask, where do I start? How do I start my testing strategy for this whole thing?
Yeah, I think that I've got lots of thoughts about this. I'll say first that your biggest bang for your buck will be to have just one end-to-end test. Just one that's like a kind of a smoke test is what we call it, where it's basically if you see smoke, then there's a problem. So if this test fails, I may not know exactly what the problem is, but I know that there is a problem, and so I can go and dive into it. The reason why this kind of a test is the most bang for your buck is because it does take a fair amount of time to set up the infrastructure and the tools and whatever. But once you have this test in place, you know a lot of things about your application actually working. You know that your compilation is like your build process is working because you're going to run it on the build. And I should back up and say that an end-to-end test would be almost like if you think about testing your application manually, you're going to start the server, you're going to start the front-end app, you're going to go to the URL. For your app, you're going to maybe log in, you'll click around, and that would be like a manual test. And so an end-to-end test would basically be doing that, but just in an automated way. And so, yeah, by doing that, your build is working. You know that your like all the event handlers are getting attached to the DOM properly, whatever else. And it doesn't have to do a lot, but just having one in place is going to give you a lot of confidence, a lot more than the 0% confidence that you have today. And so that's where I typically tell people to start. But the biggest challenge, I think, when people are just getting started is having the tools in place. And that takes a fair amount of time of research and everything. That's something that I try to address on testingjavascript.com. I have a whole module on configuring these tools on there, and people found it to be pretty helpful. But yeah, once the thing is that people, like, you're especially in a team setting, you're like, I just wish that everybody would write tests. Well, nobody's going to write tests if the tools aren't in place. And there's not like an obvious way to add and write these tests. And so your job as the person who wants to be the advocate for tests on your project or on your team is to establish the tools and write just at least one test to show kind of an example of how to use those tools to get the tests up and running. And once you do that, then the test will naturally, hopefully naturally follow. Sometimes you have to also build a culture of testing as well, but which we could talk about later too. But yeah, getting so the actual thing that you should do is set up the tool, make a pull request for that tool, and one test. And then iterate on that. Like, people are probably going to have opinions already about testing. I feel like testing, just people have so many opinions about it, and they're wildly different. And so once you have finally determined, okay, this is how we're going to do it, you get that merged in. Don't try to just like test your whole app all at once and just get like 100% code coverage. 100% code coverage is a fool's errand anyway. But just get one test in, see if you can make that a single end-to-end test. It does take quite a bit of effort, especially like getting that running on CI, because you have to figure out a way how to like get your database running and everything. But once you have that, then you get a huge amount of confidence that things are working, which is kind of what we're going for. So I can ramble sometimes, so you feel free to interrupt me if I'm doing that. But hopefully that was helpful.
First of all, it was super helpful. I think your answer can lead us in maybe 1,000 different conversations because you said a lot of things. I think all of them are the basis for really a great strategy. So essentially, just aiming towards that end-to-end test, and then starting to establish some sort of tool set. And that tool set should probably compose of some tool that is actually running the test. So, for instance, things like Cypress or a Selenium, even though developers aren't so fond of the Selenium area. Don't
use Cypress. I'm actually wearing my Cypress shirt today.
Oh, so you come prepared.
Yeah.
Okay, so so something like that, but also some things that are application specific. So like a way to target specific elements in your application, or several like a way to define workflow. So how far, or do you have like sort of a ballpark for the amount of effort that a first step to just get that into the way should take?
Yeah. So if you want to have a really low value, high impact improvement to the confidence in your project, then actually starting at the bottom of the testing trophy is where you should start. And that's the static tests. And that involves ESLint. That is like probably the easiest tool, the least friction tool to get added to your code base, to add a pretty significant amount of confidence. So low impact, high value. And then Prettier is, I also consider that a testing tool, because it will reformat your code in a way that looks funny if you get something wrong. And so it really kind of, and also like it just saves you a silly amount of time. And so definitely add Prettier. And then this one's a little bit more controversial, but I am a strong advocate for type checkers. I personally prefer TypeScript, but if you want to use Flow, that's cool too. But have a type checker. That is not a low impact. That makes actually a pretty significant impact. It's high value. It's also pretty high effort, is what I meant to say. It typically, like, you don't have to have your whole application typed from the very beginning. You can, just type certain parts, and you don't have to avoid any or unknown or whatever the any type. Just feel free to use that, especially as you're learning. One of the big mistakes people make when they're learning these type checkers is they say, my types must be perfect. But your code is not easy to make perfect types for as it is today. And so in the migration as you go, feel free to use any. It's totally fine. And then when you know the type checker better and your code is starting to transform then you can go back and fix those later. But yeah, so those are some tools that are pretty a bit lower effort and pretty high value.
And this is even before, you know, actually launching your app and seeing that it functions as you expect.
Yes, exactly. Yep. It all
And you're
happens.
already getting a lot of value.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's probably the biggest reason why it's low effort, is because you don't have to like it. The configuration of these tools typically doesn't depend as much on your infrastructure. The higher up the testing trophy you go, the more dependent you are on how the infrastructure works to get these tools working. So then the next layer, the next two layers are unit and integration testing, and those would probably be the next more difficult ones to set up. And they give you some pretty good value too. Both of those you're going to use Jest, fantastic testing framework, and that's pretty simple and straightforward to set up and configure. And I've got you know, like I said, on testingjavascript.com, I show you how to configure all of these tools. And yeah, so it's typically pretty easy to get that one set up, and then you can add one test, and that's not going to take a lot of time. That's like a day worth of work. If you know nothing about the tool at all, you're just like, I know nothing about this tool, I'm going to learn it and add it to my project. That should take a day. And ESLint, that should take like an hour, maybe two. If you like, from the perspective of somebody who's never heard of the tool before, to setting it up.
Well, if you have an existing code base and you don't have ESLint, so you're probably gonna put ESLint and then get like 1,000 errors,
yeah.
which
I'm glad that you
somehow
mentioned
needs
that.
to be
So you
fixed.
just turn off all of the errors, and then like your first
Slowly.
pull request has no rules, basically. Just like, this is how we run linting. We're gonna configure it with our CI and whatever. And then your next pull request is add one rule or add a couple rules, and then you slowly over time you add rules and make smaller pull requests as you go.
Yeah, which I think is a very important articulation of the workflow that you mention, because a lot of developers, you know, they need to wrap their heads around putting something new like ESLint, and then they try to think about it as a, you know, one big thing. But now I need, how do I start with all these errors? So it's really important.
Exactly. Now with Prettier, I have seen some teams that say we'll just add Prettier to every new file and we won't change old files. I think that's a mistake. Prettier should be a bomb, and it should be, okay, today's the Prettier day. Everybody, like, merge all the pull requests. Any open pull requests are going to have crazy merge conflicts, and so just get it all merged by Friday. And then over the weekend, I'm going to drop the Prettier bomb on the code base, and then you're set to go from there. I think that's the best way to go about that. And your git diff is going to be a nightmare. And I think that there are ways to avoid that problem, which I think is kind of interesting, but I wouldn't bother with that. Who cares? Just drop the pretty ROM. So anyway, we're going up the tree. So those tools, if you did all the static tools like ESLint, Prettier, and a type checker, the ESLint and Prettier will be pretty quick. The type checker, that one's going to take you a little bit longer. But then your integration unit test, that's going to be like a day to get that tool configured and set up, and a test written for that. It might take you longer, but it should be around that time. But then your end-to-end test with Cypress, setting up the tool is actually pretty quick and easy. The hard part is making it run in continuous integration, because you have to make sure that you can start up your application in CI, and that's going to vary widely across different projects and how you're, are you using microservices? Well, can you rely on a staging environment? Do you have a staging environment that you can point to? How is this a mono repo? How do we run all of these things? It all just so depends on your particular situation. And so, yeah, that's where things get a little bit tricky, and I can't really give you a super estimate. Like, it might take a day, it might take a week to figure it out. It kind of depends on how reliably you're able to like your current dev workflow is. But once you get it, like, you get one of those tests in and you get a huge amount of confidence. So that's why I say if you can, start with just one of those tests. Honestly, you should have the static stuff all set up. That should be pretty easy. Get that done. You should have the tool set up for unit and integration with Jest, and that should be pretty easy. And you should have one test for each of those, and then you'll have one test for your end-to-end. And once you have one test for those, then adding new tests, it just becomes a culture thing now. Now we just build it into our culture that we add tests for the things that we're changing.
Great. So I love how this conversation is going. So we're building out an organization that didn't have any tests at all, and now we're at the sort of a middle point. So now we're building a culture. Let me continue this thread. So now we have tests, but we still lack the culture, right? Sometimes some features, some things don't get delivered with, I don't want to say full coverage, but with a certain amount of certainty that they are robust and they didn't cause any sort of regressions, which lead me to discuss another point, like 2 points that you mentioned. Let's try to elaborate on that. So one was, let's not try to aim for full coverage, since that's a metric that's sort of irrelevant. So I'd love to hear more about that. And the second one is how to build a culture. And there, I just also want to set a stage with a saying that says, I've heard something that I relate to a lot, which is the best way to incorporate testing into your workflow is that the only way to run your code is through the test. And then, which works greatly for backend, but I'm curious how it functions for front end. So if you have any position like on that, it may maybe it's not irrelevant at all. So I think these 2 takes will take us to discuss how an organization can have the culture and what should it aim for in their test strategy.
Yeah, those are great points. So on the first one about 100% code coverage, I mentioned it's a fool's errand to try it. And that, that's an Elon Musk quote. He's, LiDAR is a fool's errand. They're doomed to chase after LiDAR. I feel the same way chasing after 100% code coverage. You're doomed. You can get there, but it is a waste of your time to try for 100% code coverage in applications. In libraries, it's totally different story. Libraries, I think they should be 100% covered, but applications, it's a waste. So I actually have this blog post, how to know what to test. You can find it at kcd.am/what-test. And I'll paste that blog post in our chat too. But yeah, so the idea is that code coverage is just a metric that tells you whether your whether your lines of code in your application have been run. And that is a great thing. It helps you know what parts of your app you have not yet tested, but it doesn't actually tell you whether that code is behaving properly, whether it's satisfying the use cases that it's supposed to, whether those tests are actually good tests, or if those are the type of tests that you have to change every time you make a change to the source code, which are like high friction, low value kind of tests. And we can talk about implementation details later. But the idea is that 100% code coverage doesn't give you the proper picture of confidence, which is what you're really going for in your application, in your test base. And so in this blog post, I talk about something that I haven't heard anybody talk about before, but it's called use case coverage. And there's no tool that I'm aware of that can give you a metric on use case coverage, but that's what really matters. Is if I have a function that adds 2 numbers together, then I don't care how it accomplishes that. And so maybe it does a whole bunch of weird stuff going on under the hood to make that happen. I don't care what it's doing under the hood. I care about the use case, where when I pass 2 numbers together, what I get back is those 2 numbers added. And if the numbers that I passed in happen to not take this one branch in the code, this one code path, that doesn't matter to me. That's an implementation detail. So not getting coverage on that, I don't really care so much. That's a pretty bad example because it's adding 2 numbers together. But hopefully that makes sense. Like typically, if you have 100% use case coverage, then you have probably 100% code coverage as well. But if you don't, then it's probably because the code that you have doesn't need to exist. But like the idea isn't necessarily 100% use case coverage either. I'm just mostly arguing against the idea of code coverage as the end all be all metric. It shouldn't be. What you really should care about is, does this code do what it's supposed to do? Like, being totally like ignoring the implementation detail. Focus on what it's supposed to do. Okay, so then the other thing about 100% code coverage that makes it a fool's errand is that there are so many things that you can do with your time. You can improve the product. You can do marketing. You can do all kinds of things with your engineering time. And testing is just one of those things. And so if you it's kind of a long tail problem where the first 80% of the tests are like relatively easy to write, and the last 20% of the tests are going to take 80% of the time. Like, it just takes so much time to get those edge cases covered. And you have to do sometimes some really weird things, start testing implementation details to cover some of those edge cases. And if those kind of edge case branches of code are not really important to the product necessarily, maybe it's on the user settings page when, if the user has these 12 different conditions met, then we're going to take this other branch of code. Maybe that's not all that important. Maybe that's not as important as like making sure the checkout button works, and or making sure your graph is fast, or whatever it is. And so that's why I say it's a waste of time to get to go for 100% code coverage, because there are other things that you can do to improve the user experience and even your confidence better than just going for 100% code coverage.
Cool. Great. So let's move on to the next one. So culture. How do I make everyone write their tests?
Yeah. Well, first off, it would be a good idea to avoid trying to force people to do things that they don't want to do. And so it's like, and I'm not super great at converting culture and converting people over to my way of thinking. But I know that the times that I've been most successful at kind of changing a culture has been when I try really hard to understand people and their concerns. And I'll put together a meeting where I'm going to say, okay, so I have a proposal. I want to improve our test coverage, or I want to change the way we're writing tests, or whatever. And I set up that meeting. But then before the meeting, I go and talk to each individual person one-on-one about what we're going to be talking about. And I approach them and I say, I want to make sure that we make this meeting as effective as possible. And so I want to understand all of the questions that you plan on asking before we go into the meeting, so I can prepare to answer those questions, and I can address your concerns. And they're normally very amiable to that. Even the people who were not really excited about the thing that I was proposing, they're like, yeah, totally. Let me tell you all the things I hate about your idea. And so you take notes, they list them out, and often you'll talk to several people, and many of them will have the same concern. And so you'll talk to them, you write down all the concerns, and you get all of those concerns addressed in your presentation. Sometimes even before, when they bring up the concern, you can kind of explain a few things. Because often when people are like, when it's a culture shift that's happening, the biggest thing that you're battling is fear, uncertainty, and doubt, or FUD. And so when you meet one-on-one with people, then, or here, I'll say it this way first. When you meet with a group of people together who are all experiencing that same fear, uncertainty, and doubt, what happens is they kind of turn into a mob, and they're like, yeah, well, what about this? And yeah, what about that? And they're like building on each other's anger and frustration. And then there's no way you can get control of that situation. So instead, you talk with them one-on-one, you address their fear, uncertainty, and doubt, each one-on-one in turn. And then when they come to the presentation, not only are you able to address all of their concerns in the presentation, but they already have kind of had that fear, uncertainty, and doubt kind of lessened. And so they don't turn into a mob, and you can have a more constructive conversation. So that's what I would recommend doing, especially if you know that some of the people in your group are like, UI testing is a waste of time, or whatever. You can address those things ahead of time, and then hopefully have a more successful time changing that culture. But it is something that, it's not a single meeting and now the culture's changed. It is something that's going to take a while to get people used to writing tests as they go. I wouldn't recommend doing some sort of enforcement, like you cannot have a pull request merged if you don't have tests. I think that's not actually a healthy thing for a team. You want them to write tests because they want to write tests and because they want to feel confidence in their code base. It should be a natural, more organic thing. Maybe sometimes that it can be useful if there's like one engineer who's not doing it and everybody else agrees like this is a good thing. Maybe you can have that rule. But I find that rules like that are kind of feel arbitrary and are more annoying than helpful. So yeah, it's a delicate balance. When we're dealing with code, the computer does exactly what we say. When we're dealing with people, we have to worry about emotions and like yeah, these feelings that people have, and we want to be respectful and empathetic toward them. So hopefully that is helpful.
Yeah, I mean, that actually brings up another really good point is you do hear a lot of companies that have the culture of, okay, you need X amount code coverage. If we don't have X amount code coverage in our application, then, then we're not doing well. Or, the same thing, I've heard a lot of companies who say, hey, if you don't have tests in this, then, the automatic, the build for any PR just kind of dies, right?
Yeah.
Or, doesn't pass. So what do you do? I mean, so if you look at more legacy applications, you kind of see things and you're like, okay, there's a really brittle test. Now all of a sudden we created this hot mess where we can't even refactor anything because these tests that don't even matter are failing and things like that. Like, how do you change that? Or do you have any recommendations for companies who are kind of dealing with that?
Oh, wow. That's such a great question. So the biggest reason that things like that happen is because people's tests are testing implementation details. So the tests are not good tests. And that's one area why I think a lot of people don't like testing is because they've worked in code bases where the tests were all implementation detail focused. And I've got a blog post about that as well that I can give a link to. It's kcd.im/implementation-details. And that blog post, I kind of explain what implementation details even are. And I just pasted a link in our chat so we can put that in show notes later. But I also talk about how you can avoid testing implementation details. But the idea is if like what matters to the user is that this code does what it says it's going to do. What doesn't matter to the user is how the code accomplishes that task. And so if you write your tests in a way that resembles the way your user is going to use your code, then your tests are going to be more resilient and they will break when the user's expectations would have broken. So you change your code. Well, so I'll take a step back really quick. Implementation detail tests have two major failings. They can break when you refactor your application code, which is what you talked about, and that's what we call false negatives. So it's a negative test, it failed, but it's false, it shouldn't have failed. And then it may not fail when you break your application code, that's false positive. So it didn't fail, that's positive, but it should have, so it's false. And so, and that's when we get into these situations, this hot mess of like, I hate testing because every time I try to change the code, it's breaking, and I shipped a bug in production and the test didn't catch it. So I hate tests. They're useless. And yes, I agree. Those kinds of tests are absolutely useless. And so if you avoid testing implementation details, then they can catch you when you break things that are actually going to break the user's expectation. And that all revolves around this principle of your test should resemble the way that your software is used. And if they do that effectively, then they only break when it would have broken for the user. And so that's kind of the idea behind that blog post. And a lot of it has to do with the type of tools that you're using, if they enable testing implementation details or not. That's why I wrote React Testing Library, was so that we could have a tool that that allows us to write tests that resemble the way our software is used. And it's been pretty it's worked out pretty well because people like tests failing when they're supposed to and not failing when they're not supposed to.
Yep. So user's perspective is always super important. So in every aspect of software development, I want to ask about something a little bit different. Let's talk about snapshot testing for a second. And this is out of my own personal curiosity. Let me just say, for me, and maybe you have a different idea of what it is. So snapshot testing is you have some let's say a React component which ultimately renders some HTML, and snapshot tests like sort of render that and create a snapshot of the HTML that's going to be rendered, and the test validates that under these circumstances I have the HTML that I'm expecting. So I want to ask you, what do you think about that? I can say, for my own personal perspective, I always found that to be a little bit shaky and not providing a lot of value for me, as it doesn't tell me a lot about what's actually, if we talk about the user perspective. So this piece of HTML might actually not do the thing that I'm expecting to do, because of a million other reasons. So that's just me setting the stage with my own personal opinion. But
Yeah.
I'd love to hear yours.
Yeah, I agree with you. I have another blog post, of course, that is all about this as well. It's called Effective Snapshot Testing. You can find it at kcd.im/snapshots. And the idea in my blog post is that snapshots can be really useful or really useless, and it just depends on how you're using them. And so first of all, if you're taking a snapshot of some HTML, you're absolutely right. Like, that HTML is actually totally implementation detail. The user doesn't care what the HTML looks like at all. Like, it makes no difference to them. And so what happens is you take a snapshot, and anytime you make a change, that snapshot's going to change. So you're like, okay, I'm used to this. I'll just update the snapshot, and I keep on going. And people just become so used to updating snapshots and merging pull requests that have changed snapshots that nobody reviews the snapshots. And so now your snapshots are, and especially like what happens normally is people's snapshots are very big. And so any even small change changes many snapshots and in many ways, and they're impossible to read that diff. And so what typically is going to happen is nobody reviews the snapshots. And so now your snapshot tests are actually worse than having no tests at all. Because when you have no tests at all, you know that you're not confident, and you're aware of that. And you're like, okay, I'm not confident, and I'm just accepting that reality. And maybe one day I'll write some good tests. But when you have snapshots, and you're abusing them in this way, and then you're like, yeah, great, we're confident. We have snapshots, so I don't need to write any tests for this. But you're actually not confident. So you think you are, but you're actually not. Whereas previously, you knew you weren't. And so you were maybe motivated to fix that scenario. So I very rarely use snapshots in UI tests. Like, very rarely. What I do, if you want to start with snapshots, that's fine. They're actually a really great way to get your, bump up your coverage without having to write a bunch of tests to test every single case. And especially if you're going to go into a big refactor of something, you're like rewriting from Backbone to React or something, then yeah, do snapshots. They're great because that will help you make sure you're not regressing any features. But what I typically do is I'll say, okay, let's take a snapshot, and then let's look at that snapshot and see what part of that snapshot is actually important for this test. And you'll identify, okay, this element has this label and this element has this text. That's what's important. So I'm going to encode those things of importance in my test. And so now, instead of taking a snapshot and just saying, make sure this never changes, I'm going to look for those elements, and I'll make specific assertions on those elements. And that is kind of a good way to kind of get away from the snapshot testing problem. Now, snapshots are not bad in all cases. Like, if you're writing a Babel plugin that transforms code, then like snapshots are fantastic. I love snapshots for that particular use case. Like, I don't want to look at an AST assertion, like, yuck. But CLI output as well. I use snapshots for like the help output and CLIs and stuff like that. That's pretty cool. But yeah, I pretty much never use snapshots for UI testing. Pretty much never.
Cool. Yeah, makes total sense to use that, like for AST. I love that example. So ultimately, the UI has to be tested somehow, or validated that you're delivering something that's not broken. Let's say visually, if you're talking about UI. So which leads me to ask, about what do you think about visual testing? Have you had any good impressions or any experience with some sort of this tool or another, or a methodology?
Yeah, I love that question. So I'll say first that I have never used a visual regression testing tool in production before. Years ago, I tried to set one up, and it was just a nightmare. It was really, really hard, and it was very flaky. So I never went for it. But things have changed recently, and I still haven't used an actual visual regression testing tool, which is why testing JavaScript doesn't include a lesson about it, because I can't teach what I haven't used. I don't want to recommend something that I don't know is a good idea. But I have had, and this isn't just because this is the Applitools podcast, but I'm serious. I am in love with what I've seen from Applitools. It is so remarkably good. Yeah, I'm not joking, and I'm not being paid to say this, and I'm not just trying to be nice because this is your podcast, but Applitools is very impressive. And if I wanted to do some visual regression testing, then I would absolutely use Applitools. The fact that it integrates really well with Cypress is fantastic, and with Jest as well. And so, like, here's what I love about Applitools. Aside from being a great visual regression testing tool, and visual regression testing is a great idea, by the way, in general, if it works well, which Applitools does, in the demos that I've seen anyway. But the cool thing about Applitools is that you're in Cypress, you make your assertion, and like while you're writing in Cypress, you're like, gee, I sure wish that I could run these tests in Internet Explorer, or man, I wish I knew what this Flexbox stuff looked like in Firefox. But Cypress currently today only supports Chrome, and that doesn't really bother me a ton. I'm not super concerned about that. But anytime that I've run into cross-browser issues, it was because things looked different across the browsers. It's never been, like, for several years now, it's not been a JavaScript problem. Because like, our tools are really great at unifying that. Like, you're using React, you pretty much never use browser APIs directly very often anyway. Certainly not
Babel preset env.
Yeah, that's right. So anyway, I'm not super concerned about that, but I would like to see how this looks in these other browsers. So here's what's cool about Applitools. You say, hey, let's take a visual regression snapshot here. And Applitools is going to say, okay, let me take all the DOM, including the CSS and everything. I'll send it up to Applitools servers. And then Applitools is going to pull that up in all of the browsers, in all the viewport sizes, all of that, and then take a snapshot of it. And so, like, first off, it's crazy fast because you only have to run your test in one browser just to get the DOM. And then, and so it's really fast for you. And then all of the weight is hitting on Applitools. But then you now get to see, like, the thing that actually could be different across the browsers, which is the visual part of things. And then on top of all that, like, if that wasn't enough, and making Applitools awesome enough, it also Applitools has really great ways to say, this part of the page is dynamic content. It's not important. This part of the page is the important thing. This is my assertion, is that this thing doesn't change. I want to know when this thing changes, I guess. And so that is also very awesome. So yeah, very huge fan of Applitools, and I like visual regression testing. I've just never done it in a production environment before, but I do recommend people look into it. I'm no longer at a company with a big production application, and when I was, I didn't quite get to it, so I can't really tell you from experience. I want to be transparent about that. But if I were in your shoes at a company making a product, visual regression testing with Applitools would be my first look, for sure.
Yeah, well, thank you for all these kind words. It's also, I'm a big believer in visual testing as well, which is the reason, more or less, that I joined Applitools, because I need I in my previous career situation, I would have loved to use this product. So just developing this product is an awesome opportunity also for me personally. So
very cool.
Let's I think we're close to rounding up. So question, what should we talk about? I'm wondering React hooks or accessibility. What are you more fond about?
Yeah, well, I'd say I can actually hit both of those. Talking about
Let's go
React
for it.
testing library. So a year ago, I was getting ready to do a workshop, and I was going to teach everybody how to test React applications. And I was using Enzyme because that's the only like legit tool for testing real world scenarios. But I was getting ready to have like this slide or this text document that said, here are all the things you don't want to ever do with Enzyme. Like, don't ever use instance, don't ever use set props, don't ever use set state, don't ever do any of these things because those are like implementation details. And I really didn't want to go to a company and say, hey, you should use this tool, except don't use like 90% of this tool. Only use this 10%. So I decided, what if I just made a tool that was only the things that you were allowed to do? And what came out of that was React Testing Library. And what was really cool about it is it's actually really lightweight. The biggest part of it is the queries that enable you to test your software the way that the user would use it. So if you think about this, like let's imagine a login page and you've got your username, password, maybe a remember me checkbox, and then submit button. So if you're going to test that with Enzyme, for example, or like a testing, like not React testing library, pretty much you're going to say, okay, find me the inputs. And in the first input field, I want to type this fake username. In the second input field, I'm going to type the password. I'm going to check the third input field, or let's imagine that's not there yet. And then we're going to click on the button that's in the form. Okay, well, what happens if you add a button to that login experience? What happens if you add an input like to the first, before everything else? Like, let's add another input or a hidden input, or whatever. Like, you're making implementation detail changes to those things, or maybe you change the input to a text area or something. All those are implementation details. The user doesn't care about that. That's not how the user uses your app. The user, when they come to the login page, they're going to say, okay, I need to type in my username into the username field. So they're going to look for the text username, and they'll find the form control that's associated to that label, and they'll type that in. And then they're going to find the form control associated with the label password. They'll type that in. And then they'll find the button that is labeled submit, and they'll click on that. And that's exactly what a blind user would do as well. They'll use a screen reader. They'll say, okay, here's the login input or the username input because I see that it's labeled appropriately, so on and so forth. And so that's what React Testing Library allows you to do, is instead of saying, let me get the first input, you're saying, let me get the input that's labeled username. And by doing that, and this has been the coolest side effect of this, is that people try to start using React Testing Library and they realize that, oh no, I can't do it because my form's not accessible. Well, okay, so make your form accessible. Now you can test it. And so
Wow.
you get two bangs for your buck by just using this tool, because now your tests are more resilient to changes. You could change the order of your inputs. You can add an input, you can add a button. It doesn't matter. And it wouldn't matter to the user either. You add buttons, they can still fill in that form, and they can skip the opt out of our newsletter button or whatever it is. Like, it doesn't matter to the user, and it doesn't matter to your tests. And so, yeah. And then with React hooks, because React Testing Library is so separated from the implementation details, there are literally 0 changes you need to make to your tests. If you wrote your class React tests, or if you wrote tests for your class-based component, and then you refactor that to hooks, you make 0 changes, absolutely no changes to your tests. It should still work. And that's been my experience. It's been the experience of a lot of people I've talked with, is that they totally refactored their class component to hooks, and they made 0 changes to their tests. And their tests were actually useful because it ensured that they didn't break their behavior when they did the refactor. So there you go. Two birds with one seed. We don't kill birds, we feed them.
Good. I love the paraphrase. I also think it's a horrible phrase to use. So good.
Oh my gosh, I think with that, well, at least Ken, you're so full of information. It is amazing to just hear you talk about testing and soak it all up. I tweeted it out. I shared it in our apprentice program Slack channel to say, hey, all apprentices, if you're a junior dev, you should definitely be listening to this podcast because Kent gives a really good summary of, how to think about testing in general, right? So maybe as you're creating more of this accessible content for, developers in general, maybe junior developers are going to be really the ones who are starting to bring this to their companies and say, hey, did you know that you could do this? So I love the value add that people are able to, kind of get from your content.
That's good.
Yeah, but with that, thank you everyone for listening to this episode of the Testing Tips and Tools podcast. Again, you can find Kent on Twitter, Kent C. Dodds on Twitter, and you can find Amit on Twitter as well at AmitZor. And then my name is Tracy. You can follow me on Twitter at LadyLeet. We will see you next time for the next episode.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.